cousin of my wife, who was married in the mid 70s, who we saw over the weekend. We finally ran away on a day off, and I went to Vegas and got married.
There are moments in public life when a celebrity says something so unexpectedly raw, so disarmingly honest, that the entire carefully constructed image they have spent decades building simply shifts. Not shatters, not collapses, just quietly, irreversibly tilts on its axis. For Jon Bon Jovi, that moment arrived not during a concert, not during a crisis, but during a promotional interview for a documentary. The kind of polished, controlled media setting where publicists sit just off camera and talking points are rehearsed. And yet, what came out of his mouth was anything but rehearsed. It was the kind of honesty that made people set their phones down mid-scroll, look up, and think, did he really just say that? The confession was not about a hidden addiction. It was not about a secret family, a financial scandal, or a falling out with his bandmates. It was about his marriage, the marriage that had, for decades, been held up as one of rock and roll's great love stories. The marriage to the girl from his high school history class. The marriage that survived fame, fortune, world tours, and the kind of temptation most people will never come close to experiencing. And what Jon Bon Jovi said about it stunned people. Not because it destroyed the story, but because it told the truth about what that story actually cost. To understand why the confession landed the way it did, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the band, the beginning of them. Jon Bon Jovi grew up in Sayreville, New Jersey, the kind of working-class town that produces either lifers or dreamers. Jon was very clearly a dreamer. By the time he was a teenager, he had already decided that music was going to be his way out and his way up. He was scrappy, ambitious, and magnetic even before anyone outside his zip code knew his name. And it was in that ordinary New Jersey setting, inside the very unglamorous walls of Sayreville War Memorial High School, that he first crossed paths with Dorothea Hurley. The story of how they met has been told many times, and it never gets less charming. Jon, by his own admission, attempted to cheat off Dorothea's paper during a history exam. It was not the opening chapter of a sweeping romance. It was a 17-year-old kid trying to get through a test. But something clicked between them that day that would prove, over the following decades, to be essentially unbreakable. He was drawn to her immediately, he has said, and she, with the dry wit that would become her trademark in every interview she ever gave, claimed she simply had a gift for spotting potential. There was a complication, of course, because there always is. At the time they met, Dorothea was dating Jon's best friend. So the two of them spent a couple of years in that particular kind of suspended animation that only teenagers can fully inhabit, close enough to feel something, constrained enough not to act on it. They were friends. They circled each other. And then Jon's career began its rapid, extraordinary ascent. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, he and Dorothea found their way to each other properly. It didn't hold immediately. In 1985, as Bon Jovi was building towards superstardom, the couple split. Jon briefly dated actress Diane Lane. It was a high-profile pairing that seemed to fit the narrative of a rising rock star stepping into a bigger, more glamorous world. But it didn't last, because whatever existed between Jon and Dorothea turned out to be more durable than the glitter of a Hollywood romance. They found their way back to each other. And this time, neither of them seemed willing to let it slip away again. By 1989, Jon Bon Jovi was one of the most famous human beings on the planet. Bon Jovi had just released New Jersey, which produced an almost absurd string of hit singles. The band was playing the Forum in Los Angeles, 3 sold-out nights. The kind of run that would make any manager's head spin. And it was in the middle of precisely that peak, with the whole music industry watching and adoring and profiting from his every move, that Jon did something nobody saw coming. He turned to Dorothea and suggested they go to Las Vegas and get married. Right then, that night, without telling anyone. And somehow, impossibly, she said yes. They eloped to a Las Vegas wedding chapel without informing a single person in their orbit. Not the band, not the management team, not their parents, not their closest friends. Nobody, just the two of them, slipping away from the noise of one of the biggest tours in rock history to make the quietest, most private commitment imaginable. It was spontaneous in a way that felt almost reckless given the circumstances, and yet it was also, clearly, the most deliberate thing Jon Bon Jovi had ever done. The reaction from their inner circle was, by Jon's own account, overwhelmingly negative. Management was reportedly furious. The team had spent years carefully cultivating his image as an available, desirable heartthrob, the golden-haired rock god that teenage girls across the world could project their fantasies onto. A wife was not part of that plan. A secret wife, sprung on the public with no advance notice and no strategic rollout, was even worse. The message from the industry was essentially, "You have just made a very expensive mistake." Jon's response, years later, said everything about who he was beneath the mythology. He pushed back. He refused to feel embarrassed about a decision he and Dorothea had made for themselves, and he drew a line between living for the public and living for his actual life. They were not going to apologize for choosing each other, and more than 3.5 decades later, he would point to that moment not as an act of rebellion, but as the smartest thing he ever did. For years after that Vegas chapel, the Bon Jovi marriage was treated by the media and by fans as something close to a fairy tale. In an industry littered with spectacular romantic wreckage, marriages that detonated publicly, affairs that destroyed careers, divorces that played out on the front pages of tabloids, Jon and Dorothea appeared to be the exception. The high school sweethearts who made it. The couple that fame couldn't corrupt. The proof that it was possible to be a rock god and a devoted husband simultaneously. That narrative was not entirely wrong, but it was incomplete. And in April 2024, Jon Bon Jovi decided, for reasons he has never fully explained, to complete it. He was 62 years old. He had just put out a Hulu documentary about his life and career. He was doing the full promotional circuit, the press, the interviews, the carefully scheduled conversations designed to generate interest in a project. He sat down with Michael Strahan for an ABC News special. And in the middle of what should have been a fairly standard conversation about music and legacy and survival, he said something that stopped people cold. He talked about infidelity. He talked about the road. He talked about life at the absolute peak of rock and roll excess. And he did not perform remorse or perform innocence. He acknowledged it plainly, almost casually, as if he had been carrying the weight of the unsaid for long enough and had finally decided to simply set it down. He said he was not a saint. He said the life of a rock star was not a monk's existence. And then he said 4 words that ricocheted across the internet within hours of the clip going live. I got away with crime. Just that. Simple. Direct. No hedging. No lawyerly qualification. No tears. He said it the way you might say something you have known to be true for a very long time. Something you stopped feeling the need to disguise. He followed it up by acknowledging that there had been, by his own estimate, a significant number of women during those years on the road. And he said it with his name attached on national television at 62 years old. The internet did what the internet does. The clip spread instantly. Reactions poured in from every direction, and they were not uniform. They were in fact a generational divide, so clean you could almost use it as a sociological study. Older fans, people who came of age in the 1980s, who understood the rock and roll world Jon inhabited as a matter of lived cultural reality, were largely unsurprised. To them, this was context, not confession. The excess of that era was not a secret. Tour buses, groupies, after parties that lasted for days. This was the backdrop against which every major rock band of that generation operated. Jon confirming it was, to many of them, simply a man refusing to rewrite history in his own favor. A kind of integrity, almost. Younger audiences had a fundamentally different reaction. They had grown up in a media environment where celebrity relationships are monitored and analyzed in real time, where the maintenance of a public image includes, explicitly, the performance of loyalty and fidelity, where being caught in an affair is a career event, not an occupational hazard. To them, hearing a legacy artist say, "Yeah, there were about 100 women," without apparent anguish or apology, felt deeply jarring. Not because the information was shocking in an abstract sense, but because the tone was. He was not confessing in the way people have come to expect confessions to sound. He was not prostrate with guilt. He was explaining himself, contextualizing, rationalizing, situating his behavior within a framework that he seemed to consider entirely coherent. And that gap between what he said and how he said it is where the real conversation happened. Because what Jon did in that interview was not simply admit to infidelity. He admitted to a particular philosophy of infidelity, one that drew a distinction between what happened on the road and what existed at home, one that held that a marriage could survive, could even be strong, alongside behavior that most people would consider a fundamental breach of it. Whether you agree with that philosophy or find it deeply troubling, you cannot say it was accidental. He knew exactly what he was saying. He said it anyway, which brings us to Dorothea. Because in every version of this story, in every piece of coverage and commentary and reaction, she is the most important figure and the least examined one. Dorothea Bon Jovi has spent the better part of 4 decades actively, deliberately removing herself from the spotlight her husband inhabits. She has given few interviews. She has maintained, with what appears to be genuine conviction, that her life and her family's life are not the public's business. She built a world in New Jersey that was fundamentally her own, one that existed alongside Jon's celebrity rather than being defined by it. She once said, with the kind of quiet clarity that suggests she thought about it carefully before speaking, that his life on stage was his life, not theirs. And when Jon made his confession in 2024, Dorothea said nothing publicly. There was no statement, no visible distress, no sudden absence from his side at events. The world braced for a response that never came. Because, as became apparent in the way Jon spoke about her, she had known. Not just suspected, known. The confession was news to the public. It was not news to her. What do you do with that? What do you make of a woman who, by every available account, understood the reality of her marriage and chose it anyway? Not once, not in a single act of forgiveness, but repeatedly, over decades as a sustained and deliberate choice. There are many ways to read Dorothea's silence. Some will see it as dignity. Some will see it as complicity. Some will find it complicated in ways that resist easy categorization. But what you cannot do, what the evidence simply does not support, is read it as ignorance or passivity. Dorothea Bon Jovi is, by every indication, an exceptionally clear-eyed person. She knew what she had married. She knew what the road looked like. And she decided, for reasons that belong entirely to her, that what she and Jon had built together was worth more than the alternative. Jon has never spoken about her without something that sounds unmistakably like genuine awe. He has said, in various forms and on multiple occasions, that without her he does not know what he would be. He has described her as the person who kept everything together, the children, the home, the foundation beneath all the noise. He has said that the world keeps turning because of her. And while you might reasonably ask whether a man who cheated has earned the right to that kind of reverence, there is nothing in the way he says it that sounds like performance. It sounds like a man who came very close to losing something essential and knows it. The marriage of Jon and Dorothea Bon Jovi has survived things that would have ended most relationships regardless of infidelity. In November 2012, their eldest daughter Stephanie was found unresponsive in her college dorm room, the victim of a suspected overdose. She was 19 years old. Jon has described receiving that phone call as the worst moment of his life. And given the scope of what he has experienced, that is a significant statement. He was not performing grief for a camera. He was a father who did not know, for terrifying hours, whether his daughter was going